I got up from where I sat for what seemed an age. The city appeared darker than before, as if the clouds had suddenly appeared and blocked out the sun. Maybe this was the fine particles of the radioactive fog, but whatever it was, it felt eerie, ominous, deadly. I kept expecting rain to suddenly fall from the sky, as it had done whilst I was in the cave, way back when I can't remember, but instead a light snow drizzle fell and began to coat this dead city. Even the guards of the general looked lost, but I had little sympathy for them, as I expected they had for me. I'm sure they'd rather the general had survived. Nothing was spoken whilst I was in the van with them, but it was a silence. If I could read their thoughts, I'm sure they were cursing me, blaming me, but I felt no shame nor guilt at his death, as he had only reaped what he himself had sowed. I walked through the streets which had once been full of joy and life. I saw people crying and wailing on the streets, clutching to rags and their children. They were experiencing what I had all that time ago, but I had no words to offer them. I, myself, was still not over the consequence of the dead city. I found myself leaning up against a shiny car that appeared from the outside not to be too damaged, but inside I could not say the same. A man sat clutching what looked like his rib cage. His left hand was held against the closed glass window. The window nearest to me was open. I tried to comfort him, to speak to him softly, but I found myself lost for words. It was not a situation one was trained for, or indeed one had to come up against all that often. To make matters worse, I could not hold his hand, as the nearest one to me was already occupied. His face was badly scarred, blackened like charcoal, his eyes weak and insipid. They looked upon me. He asked me to pass him a cigarette, which I found on the floor by his feet. I placed it in his swollen lip, also black, as he asked me to light the cigarette. The pupil in his left eye rolled up, and I never saw it again. I can only assume I had witnessed his eye going blind. He started to quiver and shouted as much as he could, with a gravely voice, "Give me a light." I took no offence in his tone, due to his condition, but smelling the petrol that was pouring from his car, I told him I could not find it. But I had, and carefully removed it with my hand, making sure I passed his left eye, which I knew could not see anything hidden within the clasp of my hand. I told him I would go to the shop across the road and find one. I walked off, and each footstep away, I contemplated what I was going to do, whether indeed I would return back. Could I face what I had seen again? These steps seemed so fake and slow. Then I sped up. I nearly reached the shop, when I heard his voice call out, "It's okay, I got one." With that, I turned around to see a glimpse of him light his cigarette before the car, draped in oil, blew up in my face and sent me straight through the shop window and onto broken glass on the floor. I got up, and from the shop I could see the car burning brightly. I could hear pops and squeals too. I hoped those squeals were the sounds of the metal reacting to the heat, but they could have easily been mistaken for the cries of a man being consumed by fire. I found a rucksack on the floor by my feet. I dusted it off and filled it with some tin food, with a tin opener that was hanging close by. I left the shop by its new entrance and decided I would need to find a place to sleep. Not ever wanting to sleep on the floor again, I broke into a house. I thought it was empty, and unbeknown to me, there was a family in the living room, which I found, and my face must have gone red with true embarrassment. It was strange to find people in houses anymore, almost like it used to be. I found the family huddled around, some in bed. It was an elderly woman. I did not have the nerve to ask what was the matter with her. To be honest, whilst I stood there staring, they continued with her as if I was not there. The woman was obviously dying. They had a cold flannel on her head and held her hand, speaking to her gently. One of them, maybe her daughter, explained to her mother that she was dying, that she would only have a few hours, maybe less, to live. I thought it was quite a harsh but brave thing to do. I wondered, if I were in the same situation, whether I could break this news, but it was the elderly woman's right to know. She smiled and looked at them with her weary eyes. I felt a tear in my eye fall as I watched this family's tragedy. I wondered, what were the woman's thought patterns as she knew she was dying? Possibly early on she was okay, doing the everyday normal things she would have done. Now she had the last moments of her life thrusted upon her. How could one's mind cope with such a thing? Was she going over her life? Was she in too much pain? But to just grit her teeth and bear it, just wishing the final moment to come. Did she get pains in her heart, thinking that was it only to open her eyes again and wait for the final bow? I could take it no longer and left the house so that they could grieve in peace alone. I walked up the street. The guards were getting in the van. I went up to the driver and asked for a lift. He did not answer me, but gave a small nod. So I got inside and he drove up the road out of the city and into a northerly direction, as I too had been travelling since I left the dead city. The night came and I slept as I drove. As I did so along the bumpy road, I thought about the general, about my feelings towards those in power, and considered that, if it were the people to blame, not the institution, for what would a country be without a government or its leaders, law, all of these things made up a free and fair country? These ideals were right. It was the people who spoiled them, trying to become greater, richer, powerful. If governments could be ruled with men with pure hearts, then what a world we would live in, a new world. I wondered whether I wanted the general to die, what kind of a person this made me. How could I be considered good or right, with a mind that wanted to kill, despite what he had done, the millions he had killed with his nuclear weapon? I half thought to myself whether it was because of my words that the fog had returned to kill him, and all those with him. I found more difficult questions than answers. I thought of the boy Jason, now back with his father, the bitter feeling it left within me. How he seemed to forget about me so soon, as if I was never a part of his life. There seemed so many thoughts that came back to me. It made me feel terribly sad and alone, but most of all, I felt incredibly tired. When I awoke, we had arrived at an almost serene place. It looked much like a forest clearing. There were big trees to the left of me. To the right, though, was a desert-looking area, almost in a contrast of how life used to be and how it was now. I walked across the hot desert area, the sun beating down upon me. I imagined the strong winds had swept whatever once stood there away. I was sweating as I had never sweat before. It was strange coming from a place where snow was falling to a place where a hot sun rose above. More proof of the fact that this chemical weapon could not only infuse human atomic structures, but Mother Nature's as well. It was difficult to know what really was occurring and why. I had no answers. All I had was my sight, my sound, all the senses God had bestowed upon me, as well as wisdom and the knowledge from people I had spoken to. But a lot of it was my own personal conjecture. In order for me to understand what was going on, and whether indeed what I thought was right, was an entirely different question. But then I thought much of man's life is based on this fact, that we don't really know much of situations and facts. We use our own interpretations to gauge some kind of picture in our mind. Maybe each of us, for the same situation, has a different picture, so for me to fall into this old trap only seemed natural. I stopped thinking about this line of questioning when I was at a familiar building in front of me. I say familiar, but I had never seen it before, but it was the whereabouts was known to me. It was a radio studio, and I imagined inside I would find the disc jockey I had listened to on the radio. The hot weather also concurred with the situation. One listener reported to the DJ before the transmission was lost. I cautiously opened the door and was taken aback by the stench. There, slumped on the controls, was the DJ, still wearing his headset. The metal from it had melted into his hair. His hands and face also seemed to have melted in the mixer, and which had now become his open grave. The heat at some time must have been so severe he had melted all the mixer, and two had become one. I closed the door and left, Walking further on, I came to what looked like a waste disposal area. It stretched out for miles. Maybe it was such an area, or maybe this was the remains of one giant city, all crushed up in little insignificant pieces. I stood upon this rubble, this waste, and looked out upon it. There were plenty of black bags and what looked like rubbish, but also there was rubble and body parts. Maybe it was a mixture. Was it only fitting that human remains should find their way onto a waste disposal area? I looked across at the expanse that it covered. I felt a sense of sadness as it evoked upon me the end of a once great nation, and yet the stench reminded me of the suffering that continued whilst empires rose and fell. The children, men, and women who died of curable diseases, the countless arguments, wars, corrupt politicians and leaders. I no longer looked down upon, I looked to the beautiful sunset burning bright, hues of orange and gold, which gave me a kind of comfort that mankind might have a brighter future to come.